The morning the fifth bride left, Ethan Cross didn't chase her. He stood at the edge of the ridge with his hat in both hands, staring out at the valley like a man who had already accepted the verdict the world kept handing him. That he was too much, too rough, too mountain, too storm. He didn't cry. Men like Ethan didn't cry. But his knuckles went white around that hat brim, and that said everything. If this story already has your heart, subscribe, stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this mountain reaches. The town of Harrow Ridge had a rule that nobody wrote down, but everybody kept. You didn't talk about Ethan Cross unless you absolutely had to, and even then, you kept it short. He was too big for most doorframes, too quiet for most conversations. His hands were the size of small shovels, scarred from fire lines and rope work, and 15 years of living in places most men refused to go. He smelled like smoke, even on good days. And on bad days, he smelled like the kind of smoke that meant something was already burning that couldn't be put out. He was 38 years old, and he had never once, in all those years, had anybody sit across a supper table from him and mean to stay. 5 women had tried. 5 women had packed their bags before the week was out. The town didn't blame them. The town blamed Ethan. Martha Greer was the first one who left a note. The other 4 hadn't bothered. The note said, "I am sorry, but this is not a life. This is a sentence." Ethan had read it twice, folded it in half, and used it to start his cook fire that evening. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't need to. By morning, the whole town of Harrow Ridge already knew what it said, word for word, because Martha Greer had told the stagecoach driver, who had told the postmaster, who had told everyone else. That was how small towns worked, and that was how Ethan Cross became, officially and permanently, the man no decent woman would take. "You ought to give it up," said Roy Decker, leaning against the post outside the feed store, working a piece of straw between his teeth, like he had all the time in the world and none of the sense. 5 women, Ethan. 5. At some point, a man's got to ask himself what the common denominator is. Ethan didn't stop walking. "I'm just saying," Roy called after him. "Ain't no shame in dying alone. Plenty of men do it." Ethan stopped. He turned around real slow, the way big men sometimes do when they want to make sure the turning itself carries a message. "Roy," he said, "I'll keep that in mind." He turned back around and kept walking. Roy didn't say anything else. Nobody ever did when Ethan used that particular tone. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the worst possible day for news of any kind in Harrow Ridge, because it was also market day, and everyone was already in town and already looking for something to talk about. Reverend Aldous Prine was the one who handed it to Ethan, which was already a bad sign. The Reverend only delivered things personally when he thought the recipient might need spiritual preparation beforehand. "She's coming on the Friday stage," the Reverend said, watching Ethan's face with the practiced caution of a man who had delivered quite a few difficult messages in his career. "Her name is Clara Hayes. She's from Millhaven, Kentucky. 34 years old. A widow." Ethan looked at the letter without opening it. "Who arranged this?" he said. The Reverend cleared his throat. "I may have written to the agency again. On your behalf. I told you to stop doing that. I know what you told me." "Then why?" "Because," the Reverend said firmly, "a man who lives the life you live should not live it alone. And because the last 2 letters I sent came back unanswered, but this one didn't, which tells me something. It tells you the agency is desperate. It tells me," the Reverend said, "that perhaps this woman has fewer options than most, which may make her the right fit." Ethan stared at him. "That," Ethan said, "is the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me. And Roy Decker told me I ought to make peace with dying alone this morning. Will you at least meet her? Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he took the letter. I'll meet her, he said. I'm not promising anything else. The Reverend nodded like a man who knew when to stop pushing. That's all I'm asking, he said. Clara Hayes arrived on the Friday stage, looking like someone who had packed everything she owned into one bag and then unpacked half of it because she wasn't sure she was staying. She was small. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Not frail. There was nothing frail about the way she stepped down from that coach, chin up, eyes forward, like a woman who had learned a long time ago that the only way to walk into a room that didn't want you was to pretend you owned the floor. But small. He didn't know what to make of that. He'd been told once, by his mother, God rest her, that the most dangerous thing in the world was still water. That rivers that roared and crashed over rocks were just rivers doing what rivers did, spending all their energy on noise. But still water. Water that sat quiet and deep and showed you the sky. That water could drown you before you ever saw it coming. He thought about that, watching Clara Hayes straighten her coat. Then he thought, stop thinking. Go say hello. He crossed the street. He took off his hat, because his mother had also taught him that much. Miss Hayes, he said, I'm Ethan Cross. She looked up at him. She didn't flinch. Most people flinched, meeting him for the first time. Something about the size of him, or the stillness of him. He'd never been sure which. But Clara Hayes looked up at him the way you look at a mountain range on the horizon, like something she had already decided about. Mr. Cross, she said, where do you keep your water barrels? He blinked. I'm sorry? Water barrels, she said again, patient, but not slow. For fire emergencies. I was told you live on the ridge. I did some reading about the fire activity in this region before I came. Summer this year has been drier than usual. If you're living on a ridgeline, water access is your first problem. Ethan stood there for a moment with his hat in his hand. Behind the barn, he said. How many? 4, standard size. She nodded. That's not enough for the exposure you've got. We'll need at least 3 more before July. Ethan put his hat back on, very slowly. Miss Hayes, he said, we've known each other about 45 seconds. I know, she said. I'm a fast starter. She picked up her bag. Is there anything else you want to ask me before we go? Or should we get moving? I'd like to see the property before dark. He took her bag, not because she couldn't carry it. She clearly could. But because it was the only thing he could think to do. You're not what I expected, he said. No, she agreed. People usually aren't. The ride up to the ridge was quiet, which Ethan was used to, and which Clara seemed to have no problem with, which he was not used to. The 5 women before her had filled every silence, not because they were talkative by nature, necessarily, but because silence with Ethan tended to press on people. It was the weight of him, he supposed, the way he occupied a space. It made people nervous, and nervous people talked. Clara didn't talk. She looked at the land. She watched the ridgeline. She kept track of things, he could tell, the way her eyes moved, noting this, noting that, filing it away. At one point she pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket and wrote something down. What are you writing? He asked. The slope, she said. On the eastern face. If a fire comes from the valley, it'll move faster on that side. We'll want a cleared line along the top before the dry season peaks. He looked at her. You really did read about this area, he said. I told you I did. Most people say things they don't mean. She glanced at him sideways. Then most people are wasting everybody's time, she said, and went back to her notebook. He faced forward and said nothing. But something shifted, small and careful, somewhere behind his ribs. Harrow Ridge made up its mind about Clara Hayes in under 2 days. The verdict was delivered by way of Mella Sutter, who was the postmaster's wife and who had appointed herself, somewhere around 1869, the moral center of the entire valley. "She ain't right," Nella announced to a group of women outside the dry goods store on Saturday morning. "Something off about her. Woman arrives like that? No family? No references? One bag? Widow at 34? What happened to the first husband is what I want to know." "Maybe he died," offered young Jessamine Pratt, who was 17 and still optimistic about most things. "Men don't just die," Nella said darkly. "They do, actually," said Jessamine. "It happens quite a lot." Nella gave her the look that had silenced stronger people than Jessamine Pratt, and kept going. "A decent woman comes with a history people can account for. She comes with someone who vouches for her. She does not arrive alone on a Friday stage and start telling Ethan Cross how many water barrels he needs. How do you know she told him that?" Roy Decker saw them at the stage stop. "Roy Decker," Jessamine said carefully, "watches everybody." "Roy Decker is observant," Nella said. "That's different." Clara, for her part, walked past all of it without visible effect. She went to the dry goods store on Saturday morning, asked for what she needed, paid without haggling, said, "Thank you, ma'am," to the woman behind the counter, and left. She didn't complain to Ethan about it when she got back. She didn't complain about anything, which, by the end of the first week, had begun to unsettle him more than any complaint would have. On Sunday evening, 8 days after she'd arrived, Ethan was sitting on the porch steps when Clara came and sat down beside him. Not too close, just within conversation range. They looked out at the ridge for a while. "You're waiting for me to leave," she said. He didn't deny it. "The others left inside a week," he said. "You're on day 8. "I know." "Doesn't that tell you something?" "It tells me," she said, "that the others made up their minds faster than me." He looked at her. "You haven't made yours up yet?" "I make my mind up slowly," she said, "when it matters." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hayes." "Clara." "Clara." He tried the name. It sat plain and solid in his mouth. Nothing fancy. "You're a sensible woman. You can see what this life is. I ride fire lines. I'm gone for days at a time during bad stretches. The nearest neighbor is 4 miles. The winters up here are—" "I'm from eastern Kentucky," she said. "We had winters." "The work is hard," she said. "I know. I've been doing hard work since I was 9 years old, Mr. Cross. I'm not scared of it." "Ethan," she glanced at him. "Ethan." He turned back toward the ridge. "The women who left," he said, quieter now. "They weren't wrong to leave. I want you to know that. I don't blame them. This life isn't—" He stopped, started again. "Most people need more than what I've got to give. I've made my peace with that." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happened to your wife?" He went still. "I wasn't married." "I know," she said. "I mean the one before. Before you decided you'd already made your peace." He looked at her. She met his eyes, steady and without apology. "There was a woman," he said finally, 7 years ago, before I took the ridge post. She was—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter what she was. She left for someone who had a house in town and a name people recognized. That's all." "And you decided then," Clara said. "Decided what?" "That it was going to keep going that way. That there wasn't any point in—" She paused. "You decided that your life was proof of something." He stared at her. "You're plain spoken," he said. "My first husband told me that was my worst quality." "What happened to him?" "Fever," she said simply. 4 years ago. It wasn't... We weren't..." She stopped. Her voice stayed even, but something behind it pulled tight, just for a second. "He was a good man, but we were not a good fit. I spent 6 years trying to be smaller than I was, and by the time he died, I've gotten so small I could barely find myself." Ethan said nothing. "I'm not trying to be smaller anymore," she said. I'm done with it. So when I look at your ridge and your fire lines and your 4 water barrels that aren't enough, I don't see a punishment. I see work that needs doing." "And me?" he said. "What do you see when you look at me?" She considered that. "I see a man who's decided he's the problem," she said, "when really he's just the wrong size for the places he's been trying to fit." The porch was quiet. The ridge was quiet. A nighthawk called somewhere in the dark above the tree line, and the sound of it carried the whole wide loneliness of the summer evening with it. "I'm going to say something," Ethan said, "and I need you to tell me honestly if it sounds as strange to you as it does to me." "All right." "I've known you 8 days," he said, "and that is the most sense anyone has made to me in 7 years." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No, that doesn't sound strange." She stood up, brushed off her skirt, picked up the empty coffee cup she'd set beside her on the step. "Good night, Ethan," she said. "Good night, Clara." She went inside. He sat on the steps for a while longer, looking out at the ridge, at the dark shape of the mountains against the last gray light of the sky. He thought, still water. He thought, you can drown before you ever see it coming. And for the first time, in a very long time, that thought didn't feel like a warning. It felt like something else entirely. The fire scouts came up the South Road 2 days later, and everything that had been quiet and careful and slowly building came to a complete and sudden stop. There were 2 of them, young men from the Valley Station, riding hard, horses lathered and breathing rough. "Cross!" The first one pulled up in the yard, already half out of the saddle before the horse had stopped. "Cross, we've got movement on the southern face. Lightning strikes last night, 3 of them. Foreman says it hasn't gone up yet, but the wind's wrong and it's dry as a matchbox out there." Ethan was already moving. "How far?" 6 miles, maybe less by now." He was at the barn. He had his gear down from the hooks, the heavy canvas coat, the axe, the rope, before the scout had finished his sentence. "You'll need to clear out," he said. He wasn't looking at Clara. He was talking to the scouts. "Head back down, warn the valley settlements, tell them to have water lines ready." "Ethan!" He stopped. Clara was standing in the barn doorway. She had his second canvas coat in her hands, the one he kept as a spare, hanging just inside the door. She held it out to him. He looked at it. "You take this," she said. "I'll get the water barrels positioned on the north side and start a break line along the east ridge before you get back." "Clara, the scouts can't do it before they ride down, and you'll need it done when you come back up. Tell me I'm wrong." He couldn't tell her she was wrong, because she wasn't. He took his coat. He took the spare one she was holding. He looked at her. "Stay on the north side," he said. "If the smoke starts coming heavy on the east, you get off this ridge. You hear me? You don't wait. You take the horse and you go." "I hear you," she said. "I mean it, Clara. I know you mean it." He held her gaze for one long second. "I'll be back by nightfall," he said. "I'll have supper ready," she said. He went. the scouts went. The sound of hooves faded down the south road, and then it was quiet again, and Clara stood alone in the yard, with the sun burning down out of a cloudless sky and a thin gray thread of smoke beginning to rise on the southern horizon. She looked at it for a moment, then she picked up a shovel and got to work. He came back at midnight, exhausted, blackened with ash. A burn along his left forearm, where a spot fire had jumped the line before he'd gotten clear. His horse was spent. He himself was about as close to broken as a man can get while still technically standing upright. The lamp was burning in the window. There was a fire lit in the stove, a small one, controlled, just enough for heat. There was food on the table, covered with a cloth to keep it warm. And Clara was in the chair by the window, asleep with her boots still on and a half-finished cup of tea on the table beside her. Her head tipped slightly back, her hands loose in her lap. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment. He was so tired he couldn't think straight. But he thought this. She stayed. She hadn't gone down into the valley when the smoke started moving. She'd stayed. She'd done the work she'd said she'd do. She'd kept the lamp burning. She had stayed. He crossed the room as quietly as a big man could cross a room. He took the quilt from the back of the chair and laid it over her without waking her. He ate standing at the table because he was too tired to sit down without being certain he could get back up. He looked at the window, at the darkness, at the faint glow on the southern ridge where the fire crews were still holding the line. He thought about what she'd said on the porch. "I'm not trying to be smaller anymore. I see a man who's decided he's the problem." That doesn't sound strange. Outside, the night was thick and hot and smelled of smoke and dry summer grass and the particular silence of a mountain that has just survived something. Ethan Cross set down his plate, looked at the woman asleep in the chair, and decided. He didn't say it out loud. He didn't need to. But he decided. And that decision, quiet and unmovable as the mountain itself, was the first thing in 7 years that had felt entirely, completely, irreversibly like his own. She was still asleep in that chair when the sun came up. Ethan had been awake for an hour by then, sitting at the table with cold coffee and a burn on his forearm that he'd wrapped with a strip of clean cloth sometime around 3 in the morning. He hadn't slept. He'd tried, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smoke on the southern ridge, and then he'd open them again and see the lamp and the quilt and Clara's boots on the floor, and his mind couldn't seem to decide which of those things to settle on. She woke up the way some people do, all at once, no slow drift, just eyes open and present, like she'd never really left. She looked at the quilt in her lap. She looked at the covered plate on the table that she hadn't put there. She looked at Ethan. "You ate," she said. "I did." "How's the arm?" He looked down at the wrap. "You saw that." "I saw it when you came in." She sat up, folded the quilt neat and square across the arm of the chair. "You should let me look at it." "It's fine." "Ethan." "It's a surface burn, Clara. I've had worse." "That," she said, standing up and crossing the room like the matter was already settled, "is the least reassuring thing you could have said." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down and held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He unwrapped the arm. She didn't wince. She didn't make a sound. She just looked at it the way a sensible person looks at a problem they intend to fix, turned his arm slightly toward the light from the window and said, "I need the medicine kit. Where is it?" "Cabinet above the stove." She got it. She came back. She worked in silence for a few minutes, cleaning the burn with a steadiness of hand that told him this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this. "You've done this before," he said. "My husband had a sawmill," she said. "Burns were about once a month. Worse than this, sometimes." She didn't look up. Hold still. He held still. The east line, he said after a moment. The break you started. Done. Got it cleared to the rock shelf before the smoke moved too far north. The water barrels are repositioned. I used the second to last one to wet down the near side of the barn roof, which I know you'll say was unnecessary. It wasn't unnecessary. She paused, glanced up. No? No, that was the right call. He watched her go back to the bandaging. You knew that before you did it. I thought it was right. I wasn't completely sure. That's all any of us get, he said. She tied off the wrap, smoothed the edge down, and sat back. The scouts came back up this morning, she said. Before you woke up. The south ridge held. Fire burned itself out against the rock face around 2 in the morning. He let out a breath he hadn't fully known he was holding. Good, he said. They asked about you. I told them you were sleeping. I wasn't sleeping. I know, she said, but they didn't need to see you looking like that before they rode back down. He looked at her. She looked back at him completely without apology. Like what? He said. Like a man who gave everything he had and is still trying to pretend he's got some left, she said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a horse moved in the paddock. Somewhere on the ridge, a meadowlark started up. Clara, he said. Yes? Thank you. She stood up and picked up his empty coffee cup. You're welcome, she said. Now drink something that's actually hot. The trouble started at the end of that week, not on the ridge. On the ridge, things were settling into something that felt almost cautiously like a rhythm. Ethan rode the fire lines in the mornings. Clara ran the property, checked the water stores, maintained the brake lines, kept the animals, cooked, repaired, managed. When he came back in the evenings, they ate together, and they talked, and the talking got easier every day in the way that talking does when two people stop performing for each other and start just being in the same room. But in Harrow Ridge, things were moving in the opposite direction. Nella Sutter had been gathering her opinion about Clara Hayes like a woman collecting kindling, and by the end of the second week, she had enough of it to start a considerable fire. 10 days, Nella announced to anyone in earshot at the Saturday market, which was everyone. 10 days and she hasn't been to church once. Hasn't called on a single family in this town. Works like a ranch hand and talks to Ethan Cross like she's known him 20 years. She paused for effect. You ask me, there's something wrong with a woman who doesn't need people. Maybe she needs different people, said Jessamine Pratt again, who had apparently not learned anything from the last time. Nella turned to her slowly. Jessamine Pratt, do you want to explain to your mother where you've been getting your opinions? Jessamine went quiet. Roy Decker picked up where Nella left off, the way Roy always did, because Roy and Nella had been running the same operation for 15 years, one loudly and one from the side. What I want to know, Roy said, leaning against the wagon wheel with his arms folded, is what a widow woman from Kentucky, with one bag and no references, was doing, taking a mail order arrangement to begin with. Decent women have family. They have options. Maybe her family's gone, someone said, from toward the back of the group. Maybe, said Roy. Or maybe there's reason she left Kentucky that she ain't told Ethan Cross yet. That sentence, and the way Roy let it sit there in the summer air, did more damage than anything Nella Sutter could have managed. Because Roy wasn't wrong that Clara had left things out. The question was what those things were. Ethan heard about it Monday morning. He didn't hear it from Clara. He heard it from Reverend Prine, who rode up the South Road with the particular expression of a man who wishes he were somewhere else, but has decided that duty outranks comfort. There's talk, the Reverend said, without dismounting, like he was planning to be able to leave quickly. There's always talk, Ethan said. This is more organized than usual. The Reverend pressed his lips together. Roy Decker's been asking around about her background, her first husband, the circumstances of his death. He wrote a letter to Millhaven County, Ethan. He's waiting on a reply." Ethan went very still.
"He did what?"
"He says he's just looking out for the community, making sure—" "Roy Decker," Ethan said, in a voice that had gone very flat and very quiet, "wrote a letter to Clara's county of origin to dig up information about her private history." The Reverend said nothing, which was, in its way, an answer.
Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Did she know him?" he said. "Before she came here? Any connection?" "Not that I know of." "Then he's got no standing, no right. What she's told me is enough."
"Ethan," the Reverend's voice came down a notch, "I'm not defending Roy. I'm telling you because you need to know what's coming. If there's anything in her history that's complicated, Roy will find it, and he will not be quiet about it."
"There's nothing in her history," Ethan said. "You know that?"
He didn't answer right away, and in that pause, the Reverend saw something that surprised him. Not doubt. Something harder than doubt. Something that looked almost like protectiveness. "I know her," Ethan said. "That's enough." The Reverend rode back down. Ethan didn't say anything to Clara about it that evening. He told himself that was because he didn't want to worry her. He knew, somewhere around midnight when he still couldn't sleep, that it was because he didn't know what he'd do if she confirmed there was something Roy could use. Not because it would change what he thought of her, but because it would force a conversation he didn't know how to have yet. He was still working that out when she brought it up herself. They were in the barn. He was checking a saddle girth that had been wearing thin. She was sorting through the grain stores, making a count. Tuesday morning, the kind of bright, hot morning that feels clean before it gets serious. "Someone in town has been asking about me," she said, casual, like she was reporting the grain count. He looked up. "What did you hear?" he said. "Millie at the dry goods store told me. She didn't mean any harm by it. She was warning me. Said a man named Decker wrote to Millhaven County." She didn't stop working, didn't turn around. "He'll get an answer back in a week or so." "What will it say?" She was quiet for a moment. "It'll say my husband died of fever," she said, "which is true. It'll probably also say that there was some question, for a time, about the circumstances." He set the saddle down. "What kind of question?" She turned around. She met his eyes. "The kind that gets asked when a woman is found alone in a house with a dead husband and no explanation for why she didn't call the doctor sooner." Her voice didn't shake. She had clearly decided how she was going to say this, and she was saying it. "He was sick for 9 days. I managed it myself because the doctor in Millhaven was 30 miles out, and we couldn't afford the trip. By the time I sent for help, it was too late." A pause. "Some people said I should have found a way. Some people said I didn't try hard enough." The sheriff looked into it and found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But talk is talk. "And that's why you left Kentucky," he said. "It was part of it." "What was the other part?" She folded her hands in front of her. Not nervous, something more deliberate than nervousness. "The other part was that even before he died, before any of that, I had spent 6 years trying to be a version of myself that fit into a town that had already decided who Clara Hayes was supposed to be. And I was tired." She looked at him steadily. "I was so tired, Ethan. I wanted to go somewhere that didn't already know my name." He was quiet for a long moment. "Roy Decker is going to get that letter," he said. "I know. And he's going to use whatever's in it." "I know that too." "Clara." He crossed the barn, stopped in front of her. "I want to be clear with you. Whatever that letter says, whatever came before, it changes nothing for me. She looked at him carefully, like she was checking for the truth of it. "You don't know what it says yet," she said. "I know you," he said. "I told the Reverend the same thing yesterday. What you've told me is enough." She blinked, just once. Something moved across her face, fast, a thing she was trying to contain. And then she had it back under control, but not before he saw it. "Yesterday," she said. You knew yesterday." The Reverend came up. "And you didn't—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "You didn't say anything to me last night." "I was trying to figure out how." "Ethan Cross," she said, with a firmness that was not quite anger and not quite something else. "If something concerns me, you tell me, directly. Don't manage me." "I wasn't managing you." "You were deciding what I needed to know and when. That's managing." She met his eyes. "I've been managed. I know what it feels like. Don't do it." He took that. He didn't argue it, because she was right, and he knew she was right. "All right," he said. "Straight from here on." She held his gaze for a beat longer. Then she gave a short nod, like a contract had been signed. "Good," she said. "Now, what do you want to do about Decker?" He almost smiled. "I'll handle Roy," he said. "How?" "Carefully." "Ethan." "Legally," he said. She studied him. "That doesn't mean the same thing it usually does when you say it." "No," he agreed. "Not exactly." He found Roy Decker at the feed store Wednesday afternoon, which was where Roy was most days, because the feed store had a porch and shade and a clear view of the main road, and Roy had strong opinions about staying informed. Ethan walked up and stood in front of him and waited until Roy looked up. "Cross," Roy said, in the tone of a man pretending to be relaxed. "Roy?" "Wasn't expecting you down today." "I reckon not." Ethan hooked his thumbs in his belt. "I hear you wrote a letter." Roy worked his jaw. "I'm a concerned citizen." "You're a busybody," Ethan said, with a tendency to mistake gossip for duty. "But I'm not going to argue that with you. What I'm going to say is this." He kept his voice level, pleasant even. "Whatever that letter says when it comes back, you keep it to yourself." Roy's eyes narrowed. "People in this town got a right to know." "To know what? That a woman they don't know had a hard time in a county they've never been to?" He let that land. "You're not protecting anybody, Roy. You're entertaining yourself. She's living up on that ridge with you, unmarried." "That is being handled," Ethan said, "at a pace that is the business of exactly two people, neither of which is you." Roy's chin went up. "The Reverend has already given his blessing and told me to take my time. You can ask him yourself if you need confirmation." Ethan straightened up. "Leave her alone, Roy. I'm asking you politely. This is the polite version." Roy looked at him for a long moment. "You've known her 2 weeks," he said. "I know." "You don't know anything about her." "I know more than you do." "You don't know if she's—" "Roy." Ethan's voice dropped about half a degree, which had the effect of making the temperature around them feel like it had done the same. "I've asked you politely. I won't ask again." Roy Decker, who was neither a brave man nor a stupid one, made the calculation that most people made when Ethan Cross used that voice, which was that being right wasn't worth what it might cost. "Fine," Roy said. Ethan turned to leave. "You're making a mistake," Roy said, at his back. Ethan kept walking. He wasn't afraid Roy was right. He was afraid of something else entirely. Something he'd been turning over for the last 3 days. Something that had started on a porch on a summer evening and grown quietly in the dark, like a fire building under ash. He was afraid he was running out of reasons to keep his distance. And more than that, he was starting to wonder why he'd been trying. The letter from Millhaven County arrived on a Thursday, 10 days after Roy had sent his own. Millie, at the dry goods store, signed for it, read the name on the front, and immediately sent her youngest boy up the ridge to tell Clara before it could be intercepted. Clara got to the post office first. Ethan was 2 steps behind her, because she'd told him about the boy, and he'd saddled up without a word and ridden down with her. Roy was already there. He was standing to the side of the front counter with his arms crossed and the specific expression of a man who has been waiting for a moment and believes it has arrived. Clara walked in, said "Good afternoon, Millie," to the woman behind the counter, accepted the letter, and opened it right there at the counter without going anywhere more private. She read it. Her face didn't change. She turned around. She looked at Roy Decker. "The sheriff's report is in there," she said. "Case closed. No charges, no findings. If you'd like to read it, I'll hold it open." Roy said nothing. "No?" Clara folded the letter, put it in her pocket. "Then I'll ask you, respectfully, to stop spending your time on my business. I've got enough work of my own without managing yours, too." She said it completely without heat, polite as Sunday morning. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Decker." She walked out. Ethan stood where he was for one beat, looking at Roy, who was staring at the door. "That," Ethan said quietly, "is what a woman with nothing to hide looks like." He walked out too. Clara was already at the horses, both hands on the reins of her mare, her back straight and her chin up. When he reached her, she turned around, and he could see it then. The thing she'd held together inside while Roy Decker watched. A tremor in her jaw, a brightness at the corner of her eyes that she was refusing to let go any further. "You all right?" he said. "No," she said, honest and immediate. "But I will be." He wanted to say something. He had things he wanted to say. Big, unwieldy things that hadn't arranged themselves into sentences yet, that were still raw material somewhere in his chest. What came out was, "You didn't have to do it that way." "Yes, I did," she said. "If I'd walked away, he would have said I was ashamed. I'm not ashamed, Ethan. I've got nothing to be ashamed of." "No," he said, "you don't." She looked at him. He looked at her. The summer heat came down flat and full on the street, and from somewhere inside the feed store, a dog barked once and went quiet, and the whole afternoon held its breath. "Let's go home," she said. He registered the word, home. She said it like it was already true. He followed her, and the whole ride up the ridge, that word sat with him the way that certain words do. Not in his mind, but somewhere lower, somewhere that didn't have a name. The place where things become real before the brain catches up. Home. He wondered when it had started being that. He wondered, more precisely, if maybe it had been that since the very first evening she'd asked where he kept the water barrels. And if maybe the whole problem, the whole long, quiet, 7-year problem, had never been about the women who left at all. Maybe it had always been about whether he'd let anyone stay. 3 days passed in the particular quiet that settles between two people who have said something important and are still deciding what comes next. Not an uncomfortable quiet. That was the thing Ethan kept coming back to. He'd lived alone long enough to know every kind of silence there was. The kind that pressed, the kind that accused, the kind that came from having nothing left to say. This one was different. This one had weight to it, but it was the weight of something being built, not something left behind. Clara cooked, Ethan rode the lines. They ate together every evening. They talked about the property, about the water stores, about the fire reports coming up from the Valley Station. They talked about small things, and a few things that weren't small at all. And the talking kept getting easier, in the way that breathing gets easier once you stop holding your breath. But neither of them touched the word she'd said on that street in Harrow Ridge. Home. It sat between them like a stone in a river, everything moving around it, everything aware of it, nobody picking it up yet. Until Thursday evening, when Clara set a plate in front of him, poured herself coffee, sat down across the table, and said without any particular preamble, "I think we should talk about the arrangement." Ethan looked up from his plate. "What about it?" he said. "It's been 3 weeks," she said. "The original agreement was a trial period. You should tell me what you're thinking." He put his fork down. "What I'm thinking," he said, "is that you cleared a fire break on the East Ridge alone while I was gone, talked down Roy Decker in front of half the town, and told me straight to my face when I stepped wrong. And you made supper every night and didn't complain once." He looked at her. "What I'm thinking, Clara, is that the trial period ended about 2 weeks ago." She was quiet for a moment. "That's not an answer," she said. "It's the only answer I've got." "Then say it clearly." He was quiet, not because he didn't know, because he was measuring the words, the way a man measures a crossing, not afraid, just careful about where he puts his feet. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Permanently, if you're willing." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. "I'm willing," she said, just like that. No decoration, no performance. Just 2 words, sitting flat and solid in the kitchen air like they had always belonged there. He nodded. She picked up her coffee. They finished supper, and somehow that was exactly right. No more and no less than the situation needed. Clean and decided, like a knot tied properly. But Ethan lay awake that night staring at the ceiling, and he was not thinking about fire lines or water stores or anything practical at all. He was thinking about the way she'd said, "I'm willing." No hesitation, no condition, no hedge. And what it meant that a woman who'd spent 6 years becoming smaller had walked up to a mountain of a man on a mountain of a ridge and said that without flinching. He was thinking that he did not deserve it, probably. He was thinking he intended to try anyway. The Reverend came up Saturday morning with what he described as paperwork, and what turned out to also include a fairly significant piece of news. "There's a land assessor coming," he said, before he'd even fully dismounted. "From the territorial office, due in Harrow Ridge on Tuesday." Ethan took the papers the Reverend was holding out. "What kind of assessment?" "The railroad kind," the Reverend said, and left that sitting there. Ethan went still. The railroad had been a rumor in this valley for 2 years. A rumor most people had stopped believing in, because the surveyors who'd come through in '72 had moved on without filing anything, and the territorial office had gone quiet, and everyone had decided the mountain was too difficult and the route too expensive, and that was that. "They're serious this time?" Ethan said. "Serious enough to send a man with authority to file." The Reverend pressed his lips together. "The route they're looking at runs through the South Ridge, the lower section. That's grazing land. 3 families have stock agreements on that section." "I know." "And the Ridge Access Road goes straight through it." "Yes." The Reverend looked at him. "It also borders your property line on the eastern edge." Ethan looked at the papers in his hand. They were preliminary survey copies, the kind that got filed before the formal claim, the kind that looked like bureaucracy, but were actually the opening move in something much larger. "Who knows about this?" he said. "In town? Roy Decker for certain. He was at the land office when the notice arrived." The Reverend paused. He seemed pleased. Ethan raised his eyes slowly. "Roy owns property on the South Flat," he said. "He does?" "Which the railroad would have to buy out." "At a considerable price," the Reverend said quietly. "If the route goes through." Ethan set the papers down on the porch rail. "So Roy Decker has spent the last 3 weeks making Clara's life difficult," he said, "while sitting on the information that a railroad deal was coming through that would make him a wealthy man." "I don't want to speculate," the Reverend said. "I'm not speculating," Ethan said. "I'm connecting dots." The Reverend said nothing, which was again its own kind of answer. Clara appeared in the doorway behind them. She'd heard enough. He could tell by the set of her jaw, not alarmed, not panicked, but alert in the way she got when she was calculating something. "The eastern edge of your property," she said. "If the route goes through the South Ridge, does it affect your fire access road?" "Potentially," he said. "Can they take it?" "If they file, and the territorial office approves the route, they can compel a sale." "At what price?" "Whatever price they decide is fair." She was quiet for a moment. "And if someone contests it?" "Takes money, takes lawyers, takes time." He picked the papers back up. "Most Ridge families don't have any of those." "But someone who knew it was coming," she said slowly, "could file a counterclaim on adjacent land before the assessment was complete. Lock in the boundary. Make the route more expensive to push through." Both men looked at her. "I'm a widow from Kentucky," she said, "not a lawyer. But my first husband spent 3 years fighting a timber company over a millwright. I know how these filings work." She stepped out onto the porch. "You need to get to the land office before that assessor arrives Tuesday. If you can file on the eastern access corridor, you change the math on their route." Ethan looked at the Reverend. The Reverend looked at Clara like he was revising a number of previous assessments simultaneously. "She's right," he said. "I know she's right," Ethan said. "I usually am," Clara said, without a trace of satisfaction in it. Just fact. Monday morning, they rode down together. It was the first time they'd gone to town at the same time, together, as a unit, and Harrow Ridge noticed immediately. That was the thing about small towns. They didn't miss arrivals. Every head turned, every conversation paused just long enough to register, adjust, continue. Ethan walked into the land office with the papers the Reverend had brought, and Clara walked in beside him. And when the clerk behind the counter looked up and saw the two of them, he did a particular kind of double-take that told Ethan the clerk had already heard about Roy Decker's letter and the general standing opinion of Ethan Cross's domestic situation. "I need to file a boundary affidavit on the eastern access corridor," Ethan said. "Sections 14 through 19, before the territorial assessment on Tuesday." The clerk blinked. Yes, that's possible, but the filing fee..." "What is it?" The clerk told him. It was not a small number. Ethan didn't react to it. He reached into his coat. He counted out what he had. It wasn't enough. He didn't move. He kept his face level. He was calculating. The cattle he could sell, the time it would take, the fact that Tuesday was tomorrow, and tomorrow was not enough time. "Add mine," Clara said. He turned to look at her. She was already at the counter, opening the small leather purse she carried, counting bills onto the counter beside his. "Clara, it's my land too," she said quietly. She didn't look up. "If we're doing this permanently, then it's mine too. That's how it works." The clerk looked at the money. He looked at both of them. "That'll cover it," he said. Ethan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "File it," she said to the clerk. Roy Decker saw them come out. Of course he did. Roy Decker had a talent for being in the exact location where things were happening. and he was standing in front of the general store with two other men Ethan recognized as having property interests on the South Flat. Roy's eyes went to them, went to the land office door. His expression shifted in a way that told Ethan clearly that Roy understood exactly what had just happened. He walked over. "Cross," he said, "I hear you filed this morning." "You hear fast," Ethan said. "Boundary claim on the East Corridor." Roy's voice had an edge to it now that he wasn't bothering to soften. "You know what that does to the survey route." "I have an idea. It makes the whole thing more expensive. The railroad might walk away from the deal entirely." "Might," Ethan said. Roy looked at Clara. Was this her idea? Clara met his eyes without expression. "Does it matter?" she said. "Yeah," Roy said. "It matters. Because a woman who's been here 3 weeks has no business—" "Roy." Ethan stepped slightly forward. Not aggressive, just present, the way a wall is present. "What she does or doesn't do is not your concern. What affects your property deal is your concern, and I understand that. So let me be straight with you." He kept his voice even. "That access road is how I fight fires on this ridge. It's how the valley gets warning when something comes down from the south. You take that road, you're not just taking land. You're taking the one thing standing between your town and the next fire season." He let that land. "File what you need to file. Contest it if you want. But you think hard about what you're actually asking for." Roy's jaw tightened. The two men beside him shifted, glancing at each other. "This isn't over," Roy said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It probably isn't." Roy walked away. The two men went with him. Clara let out a slow breath beside him. "He's not done," she said quietly. "No." "What does he do next?" "I don't know." Ethan watched Roy go. "But he'll do something. Men like Roy always do." He found out what Roy did on Wednesday morning. A rider came up from the Valley Station before dawn. Not a fire scout this time, which was the first sign that something was different. A town rider, one of the young men who worked odd jobs around Harrow Ridge. Ethan met him at the gate. "What is it?" "Man in town," the rider said, breathing hard like he'd pushed the horse. "Came in on the late stage last night. Says he's from Mill Haven County, Kentucky. Says he's looking for a woman named Clara Hayes." The whole world seemed to pause for a beat. "What kind of man?" Ethan said. "Lawyer," the rider said. "Or near enough. Had papers with him. Talked to Roy Decker for about an hour last night at the hotel." Ethan said thank you. He paid the boy. He stood in the yard for a moment after the rider left. Then he went inside. Clara was already up, already dressed, standing at the stove. She turned when she heard him come in. She looked at his face, and she knew, immediately, the way she always seemed to know. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She didn't move while he talked. She kept her hands around her coffee cup, and she listened, and her face went through something. Not fear, not guilt, but a kind of exhausted recognition. Like a woman who has been waiting for a particular thing to arrive and can't quite decide whether to be relieved it has. "His name is Gerald Pence," she said when Ethan finished. "He was my first husband's business partner. After Daniel died, there was a disagreement about the mill assets. He claimed Daniel had promised him a half share before he died. He had no documentation. The court found in my favor." She set down her coffee. "He didn't accept it." "He's been following you?" "Not following. Waiting." She pressed her lips together. "He knew I'd have to go somewhere eventually, start over somewhere. He's been patient." "What does he want?" "He wants the mill property. I sold it when I left.
He believes the money from the sale should have gone to him. She looked at Ethan directly. It didn't. It was legally mine. I have the documentation. But Gerald Pence has money and patience and a complete inability to accept that he lost. Ethan was quiet for a moment. And Roy Decker talked to him for an hour, he said. Her mouth pressed tighter. Roy told him where to find me. Most likely. He'd do that, she said. Not because he cares about Gerald Pence, because it complicates things for us, for the land filing. She stood up straighter. He's using it. Yes. She turned back to the stove, then turned back around. I should have told you about Gerald, she said. I didn't think he'd follow it this far. I should have told you. You're telling me now. Ethan. Clara. He waited until she looked at him. Whatever came before, however far back it goes, you tell me and we handle it. That's how this works now.
Straight, remember? Both directions. She looked at him for a long moment. Straight, she said. We go down today, he said. We talk to this man. If he has a legitimate claim, he can file it and prove it in a court that isn't Millhaven County. If he doesn't, he doesn't. Then we say so to his face and let him make his next move in public. She nodded. She picked up her coat. Ethan, she said at the door. Yeah? Thank you for not asking me if it was true. He looked at her. The thought didn't cross my mind, he said. Gerald Pence was a narrow man, the kind that takes up less space than he should and compensates for it by choosing rooms where he can sit with his back to the wall. He was in the hotel dining room when they found him, with a cup of tea and a leather document case on the table in front of him, and he looked up when they walked in with the specific expression of a man who has prepared for a confrontation and is mildly irritated it arrived before he was fully ready. Roy Decker was not in the room, but Nella Sutter was, at a table in the corner, which amounted to the same thing in terms of information getting out. Mrs. Hayes, Gerald Pence said. He didn't stand. Mr. Pence, Clara said. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. Ethan remained standing. Gerald looked up at Ethan. The look lasted about half a second before he decided that looking at Clara was preferable. I've come a long way, Gerald said. I know, Clara said. And I'll save you some time. The answer is no. It was no in Millhaven County Court. It is no today. Whatever Roy Decker told you about our situation here, nothing has changed the fact that Daniel's estate was settled legally and the proceeds are not your money. The court made an error. Courts can be appealed, Clara said. You know that. You chose not to. She folded her hands on the table. Which tells me this isn't about the law. This is about you needing it to not be over. Gerald's jaw tightened. I have documentation. Show it to a judge, she said, in the proper jurisdiction, with proper notice. Follow the process. She stood up. But if you've come here thinking I'm alone and scared and easier to pressure than I was in Kentucky, you've made a long trip for nothing. She looked at him steadily. I am not alone, and I have not been scared of you in quite some time. She stepped back from the table. Gerald looked at Ethan. Really looked at him this time. Ethan looked back. She's right, Ethan said simply. Follow the process. Anything outside the process becomes my business. He said it without heat, without threat exactly. Just a statement of fact, the way you state that water runs downhill. You understand me? Gerald Pence understood him. He picked up his document case. He did not say goodbye. He left money for the tea and walked out of the dining room without looking at Nella Sutter, which was probably the only smart decision he made that morning. Nella Sutter, for her part, sat very still, watching Clara like a woman who has spent considerable energy building the story and has just watched the ending change. Clara turned to Ethan. "Let's get back," she said. "Yep," he said. They were almost at the horses when Jessamine Pratt came out of the dry goods store at a near run, which was unusual enough that both of them stopped. "Cross." Jessamine was breathing fast. She was looking up the valley, not at him. "Smoke. South face. I've been watching it for 10 minutes, and it's moving wrong." Ethan turned. The smoke was wrong. He could see it immediately. The color was wrong, and the direction was wrong, and the rate of spread was wrong for an accidental fire on a calm morning. "That's not natural," Clara said, beside him. Quiet. Certain. "No," he said. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Go," she said. "I'll get the water lines ready." Clara, "Ethan, go." He went. He was on his horse and moving before he fully finished the thought that was forming in the back of his mind. The thought that the timing of this was not coincidental. That a fire breaking out on the South Ridge on the same morning a lawyer arrived from Kentucky and a land assessment was due was not the kind of coincidence that deserved the name. Someone wanted this ridge burned. Someone wanted the land valuated after the fire, not before. And somewhere behind him, Clara Hayes was riding back up that road, alone. He pushed the horse harder. He told himself she'd be fine. She knew the property. She knew what to do. He told himself that. But the smoke on the South Ridge was dark and moving fast, and the summer had been bone dry for 6 weeks, and the wind had shifted this morning in a way that nobody had predicted. And the Eastern Access Road, the one they'd filed on yesterday, the one that was now contested and tangled in competing claims, was the only road that led back up to her. He had 1 hour, maybe less. He rode like the mountain itself was burning, because it was. The fire moved the way liars move, fast when nobody was watching, and faster once they were. Ethan had ridden fire lines for 15 years. He knew how a natural fire behaved. He knew the patterns, how it followed fuel, how it climbed with the wind, how it paused at rock faces and exploded through dry grass and crept along ridgelines like it was thinking. He knew fire the way some men know horses, from the inside out. This fire wasn't thinking, it was running. And it was running in a direction that made no sense for where the smoke had started. He pulled up at the first junction on the South Road, where the access split toward the valley floor and the upper ridge, and he stopped long enough to read the smoke column properly. The color, the height, the lean of it. A natural fire in this terrain, with this morning's wind, would be pulling northeast. This one was pulling northwest, toward the water sources, toward the brake lines Clara had spent the last 3 weeks building. Somebody had set it at a second point, maybe a third. He felt the anger move through him, clean and cold, the way it always did when it was the useful kind. Not hot, not blind, but sharp and directed, like a tool being picked up. He pushed the horse up the ridge road. The smoke was thicker by the time he reached the property line. Not on the structure, not yet, but close enough that the air had that particular texture to it. The one that meant the fire was making decisions about where to go next, and hadn't decided against him yet. He heard her before he saw her. "Pull it to the left! The left! Yes, that's it! Keep it moving!" He came around the barn and stopped. Clara was not alone. There were 4 people in the yard with her. 3 men from the neighboring properties, and young Jessamine Pratt, who had apparently followed Ethan's horse at a hard gallop and arrived on the ridge 20 minutes after he had. They had a water line going from the repositioned barrels to the near side of the barn. They had shovels. They had a brake line being cut along the eastern fence at a pace that told him they'd been working for a while. Clara had organized all of it.
She was standing at the center of it, directing without shouting, her voice clear and carrying and completely without panic. The way a voice is when the person behind it has already processed the fear and moved past it into work. She saw him the same moment he saw her. "The second ignition point," she said immediately, no preamble. "It's at the lower creek bend. Someone dragged brush into the gully before they set it. That's why it's moving wrong." "I know," he said. He was already off the horse. "How long?"
20 minutes before it reaches the east line. Maybe 30 if the wind holds."
She handed a length of rope to one of the men without looking away from Ethan.
"Jessamine found the drag marks when she rode up. Fresh. Done this morning."
He looked at Jessamine. Jessamine Pratt, 17 years old and apparently made of sterner stuff than anyone had previously credited, looked back at him with the expression of someone who had already been scared and decided to be angry instead.
"Boot marks, too," Jessamine said. "2 people, maybe 3, near the gully where the brush was piled."
"You recognize the marks?"
"One of them wore square-toed boots," she said. "Roy Decker wears square-toed boots. I've seen them since I was 10 years old."
The yard went quiet, except for the sound of the water line and the distant voice of the fire on the south wind. Ethan looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him. "Finish the east line," he said to the men with the shovels. "Get the water up to the north side of the barn and wet it down. Don't let anyone get between the line and the smoke." He turned back toward his horse.
"Where are you going?" Clara said.
"Back down."
"The fire
is being handled," he said. "You're handling it." He looked at her directly. "I need to handle Roy Decker."
"Ethan."
She caught his arm, not stopping him. She knew she couldn't stop him, and that wasn't what she was trying to do.
"Be careful," she said, "about how you do it. If he's got the territorial assessor in his pocket, anything you do wrong today becomes ammunition."
He looked at her hand on his arm. He looked at her face. "You're right," he said.
"I usually am,"
she said, which was the same thing she'd said 3 weeks ago in the Reverend's company. And hearing it again, here, in smoke and danger and the middle of everything terrible, hit him somewhere in the chest so hard, he almost forgot how to breathe for a second. "I'll be careful," he said. He went. Roy Decker was not in town. That was the first thing Ethan registered when he rode down the main street of Harrow Ridge. The absence of Roy's wagon outside the feed store. The absence of Roy's horse at the rail. The absence of Roy himself, from every place Roy was habitually found. The second thing he registered was the territorial assessor's horse outside the land office. He went to the land office first. The assessor was a man named Whitfield, compact, middle-aged, with the particular look of a government official who has spent enough time in territorial outposts to be surprised by very little. He was at the counter when Ethan came in, going over survey maps with the county clerk. He looked up. "Mr. Cross," he said, which meant he already knew who Ethan was, which meant Roy had done his work thoroughly. "Mr. Whitfield." Ethan put his hands flat on the counter. He didn't raise his voice. "There's a fire burning on the South Ridge. Started this morning at 2 points that don't correspond to any natural ignition source. Fresh brush drag marks in the creek gully. Boot prints from at least 2 people. My property and 3 neighboring properties are in the fire's path." Whitfield's expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. "That's a matter for the sheriff," he said. "Sheriff Tomlin is at the East Valley station. Won't be back until Friday." Ethan held his gaze. "You're the senior territorial official in this county right now, Mr. Whitfield, which means the responsibility for documenting what happened on that ridge today sits with you." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. "You're saying the fire was set deliberately?"
I'm saying it moved like it was. And I'm saying the timing. The morning of your assessment, 2 days after a competing land filing, a week after a lawyer from Kentucky showed up at Roy Decker's invitation. That timing is either the worst coincidence I've ever seen, or it isn't a coincidence at all. The county clerk, who had been very busy looking at the maps and not at either of them, quietly stopped pretending. Whitfield closed the survey folder. "Where is Decker now?" he said. "I don't know," Ethan said. "That concerns me more than where he was this morning." He found Roy Decker at the hotel. Not hiding. Roy wasn't the kind of man who hid. Because hiding required an acknowledgement of guilt that Roy was not built for. He was in the dining room with Gerald Pence and a man Ethan didn't recognize. All three of them with papers on the table and the focused energy of people mid-plan. Ethan walked in. Roy looked up. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who has been waiting for a moment and is quietly pleased it has arrived. "Cross," he said. "Sit down." "I'll stand," Ethan said. "Suit yourself." Roy leaned back in his chair. "You look like you've been riding hard." "There's a fire on the South Ridge." "I heard." "Did you?" Roy met his eyes steadily. "Word travels." "Roy." Ethan kept his voice level, kept his hands easy at his sides. He was aware of the room. Nella Sutter's absence was notable, which meant she wasn't here to witness this for Roy's benefit, which meant Roy wasn't planning on needing a witness. "Tell me what you want, directly. Whatever you and Mr. Pence have put together, lay it out." Roy glanced at Gerald Pence. Something passed between them. "All right," Roy said. "Directly." He folded his hands on the table. "The railroad deal is worth a lot of money to a lot of people in this valley. Your filing on the Eastern Corridor complicates that. We want it withdrawn." "No." "In exchange," Roy said, as if Ethan hadn't spoken, "Pence drops his claim against your—" he paused, "against Mrs. Hayes. And we stop asking questions about how a widow woman with a disputed estate managed to come up with a filing fee inside 3 weeks of arriving in this county." Ethan looked at him. He looked at Gerald Pence. He looked at the third man, who had not been introduced, and who had the specific stillness of someone whose job it was to listen and report back. "You're threatening her," Ethan said. "I'm presenting options," Roy said. "You set that fire." Roy didn't blink. "Prove it." Jessamine Pratt found boot tracks, square-toed. Ethan looked down at Roy's feet and back up again. "The assessor is at the land office right now. He's going to want a statement." Roy's jaw tightened. "Whitfield works with the railroad, same as everyone else in the territorial office. He's going to do his job," Ethan said. "Because I walked in there and made sure he understood that doing his job today, on the record, in writing, was the only thing standing between him and a territorial inquiry about why an arson fire happened to break out on the morning of his survey." He paused. "Whitfield is not your friend, Roy. He's the railroad's friend. And the railroad does not need arson attached to a land deal. It makes the deal ugly. It makes the deal expensive. It makes lawyers from the eastern states start asking questions that nobody in this valley wants asked." Roy was quiet. Gerald Pence cleared his throat. "Now look. You," Ethan said, without looking at him, "are from out of state. You have no standing in this county. Your claim was settled in Millhaven, and you know it. Go home." The mill proceeds were legally Clara Hayes' property and remained so. He looked at Pence then, fully. "File whatever you want to file. Hire whatever lawyer you want to hire. But if you come back to this county with anything other than a proper legal process, I will make it my personal business to ensure every court between here and Kentucky knows about the morning you sat at a table with an arsonist and called it a meeting." He let that land. "Am I clear?" Gerald Pence picked up his document case. He stood up. He walked out without saying another word, and this time he didn't leave money for the tea. The third man, the quiet one, made a note on the paper in front of him, which told Ethan that the note was not going to Roy. Roy saw it too.
Ethan watched Roy see it, watched him understand what it meant.
"Who is he?"
Ethan said quietly. Roy said nothing. The man folded his paper. He looked at Ethan. "Railroad company representative," he said pleasantly. "We don't generally introduce ourselves until we need to." He looked at Roy. "Mr. Decker, I'll need a full accounting of this morning's activity before we can proceed with any filing on your behalf." Roy's face went through something complicated. "You can't—" "Sir," the man said, and he said it the way money says things, which is to say, without warmth and without hesitation. "A fire on contested land during an active assessment is the kind of thing that stops deals. I'd suggest cooperating fully with Mr. Whitfield's inquiry." Fully. He picked up his own document case and nodded to Ethan. "Mr. Cross, the Eastern Corridor filing stands, pending review. Good day." He walked out. Roy Decker sat at the table alone, with his tea getting cold, and the particular expression of a man who has played a hand badly and knows it. Ethan looked at him for a moment. "I'm not going to gloat at you," he said. "I'm going to tell you something true instead. That ridge is the reason this valley doesn't burn. The access road, the fire lines, the water system Clara has spent 3 weeks improving. That is what stands between every family down here and the next bad season. You try to take it again, for any reason, and I will fight you every way the law allows." He straightened up. "And Clara Hayes will help me. So think hard about whether you want to spend the next 10 years losing to 2 people instead of 1. He turned and walked out. The fire on the ridge was under control by mid-afternoon. Not out. Fires like that didn't go out in hours. They had to be watched and managed and slowly starved. But under control. Held. The east line had held. The barn had held. The brake lines Clara had built over 3 weeks had done exactly what brake lines are supposed to do. Ethan rode up to find her sitting on the porch steps with dirt on her hands and a long burn mark on the cuff of her sleeve that had caught on an ember and been put out before it became serious. She had a cup of water and the expression of someone who has been carrying a great deal of weight for a great many hours and has only just set it down. He tied the horse and walked over. He sat down beside her. She looked at his face, reading it the way she always did. Quick, thorough, practical. "It's handled," she said. "For now," he said. Whitfield opened an inquiry. The railroads man was already in the room. He was there to watch Roy, not to help him. "Roy's going to have a hard time of it." "And Gerald?" "Gone." She let out a slow breath. "The east line held," she said. "I know. The barn's fine. The water stores took a hit. We used most of what was in the north barrels, but the structure is intact." "Good." She turned to look at him. "Roy did it," she said. Not a question. "Most likely." "Will they prove it?" "Maybe not in a court," he said. "But the railroad knows. And the railroad deals with Roy Decker, now knowing what he's willing to do to move a land deal. That changes everything about how they deal with him." She was quiet for a moment. "Jessamine Pratt," she said. "Yeah." "She rode up here alone, worked the line for 3 hours. She's 17 years old." "She's something," he said. "She's going to be formidable when she's 30, Clara said.
and there was something warm in her voice that hadn't been there when she'd arrived on the Friday stage 5 weeks ago. Something that sounded like belonging. Like a woman who has started caring about the people around her because they've started being her people. Ethan noticed it. He filed it. "The neighbors," he said. "The 3 men who helped." "Came up without being asked," she said. "Jessamine told them on her way through." She paused. "Tom Aldridge, the one with the gray horse. He told me his family has run stock on this ridge for 20 years. Said he'd rather work a lime than watch his summer range burn." She looked at her hands. "Nobody came up when the other fires happened. You told me that. You always handled it alone." "Yes. Because they didn't know me," he said. "They knew of me. That's different." She looked at him. "You've been alone up here so long that people forgot you might want company."
He considered that.
"Maybe," he said. "Not maybe." She set down the water cup. "You built this whole life like you expected to hold it alone. The water barrels, the fire lines, the way you ride out without telling anyone where you're going or when you'll be back. It's all built for one person." She met his eyes. "That changes now. I need you to tell me where you're going. I need to know the route. I need to be in this with you, not waiting at the window for you to come back." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a fair ask," he said. "It's not an ask," she said, gently but clear. "It's how this works. You said straight, both directions. That means I get to say when something needs to change." He nodded. Slowly. The way a man nods when he knows he's being offered something better than what he had before and is still getting used to the size of it. "All right," he said. She reached over and picked up his hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. Just picked it up the way you pick up something you've decided belongs to you. Turned it palm up. Looked at the rope burns on his palm from the morning's ride. She didn't say anything. She just held it. He let her. The Reverend came up Sunday morning and married them in the yard, with Tom Aldridge as witness, and Jessamine Pratt crying steadily into her handkerchief, in the way that some people cry at weddings, which is to say, completely and without embarrassment. It wasn't a long ceremony. Neither of them wanted long. Long felt like performance, and they had spent enough of their lives performing for audiences that wanted them to be different. The Reverend said the words. They said their words. He put a plain gold band on her finger, his mother's ring, which he'd kept in the same drawer for 15 years without knowing why. He knew why now. Clara looked at the ring. She didn't cry. She pressed her lips together and breathed and looked at him with the expression she always wore when something moved her that she hadn't expected. "That was your mother's," she said. "Yes." "You kept it." "I kept it." She turned her hand, looking at the way it caught the morning light.
"I'll keep it better," she said.
Tom Aldridge started clapping before the Reverend finished his final sentence. Jessamine sobbed louder. Clara laughed, a real laugh, the kind she didn't use often, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, and the sound of it did something to the air on that ridge that Ethan didn't have a word for, but felt in every part of himself that had been quiet for 7 years. The territorial inquiry found evidence of deliberate fire setting at 2 points on the South Ridge. Roy Decker denied everything with the commitment of a man who has decided that denial is the only option remaining. The railroad company, which did not want a land deal tainted by arson, quietly removed Roy from their list of preferred sellers and rerouted their preliminary survey 6 miles to the east, away from the contested corridor. Gerald Pence filed one more complaint in Millhaven County Court. The court dismissed it inside 3 weeks. Neither of them heard from him again. Nella Sutter told anyone who would listen that she had always thought Clara Hayes had good character, which was revisionism of a fairly spectacular kind. But Clara let it stand.
She had no interest in old battles. She had work to do. The Eastern Access Road was formally registered in both their names by August.
Ethan Cross and Clara Cross, which was how she signed the filing document and how she signed everything after.
The day the papers came through, Ethan found her at the porch table in the evening, going through the next season's supply numbers the way she did most evenings now. Organized, methodical, always 3 steps ahead. He sat down across from her. He looked at her. She looked up. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She studied him. "You've got something on your mind." "I've got a lot on my mind." "Then say it." He was quiet for a moment. The summer evening was full around them. The meadowlark somewhere in the tree line, the low sound of the horses in the paddock, the smell of dry grass and wood smoke, and the particular cooling of a mountain when the sun finally drops. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to not dismiss it." She set down her pencil. She gave him her full attention, the way she gave everything her full attention when she decided it mattered. "The woman who left 7 years ago," he said. "I decided something when she left. I decided I was the problem. And I built everything after that to prove I was right." He held her gaze. "You were the first person who looked at that and told me the truth about it. Not to be kind, not to fix me, just because it was true." Clara said nothing. "I need you to know," he said, "that I see what you did. Not just the fire lines and the land filing and the water barrels. What you actually did." He paused. "You came to a place nobody wanted you, and you decided to belong to it anyway. You didn't ask anyone's permission. You just decided." "Yes," she said quietly. "That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across her face. That thing she always almost let go and then caught. But this time, she let it go. "I was terrified," she said. "That whole first week. Every morning I woke up and thought, today he'll say it's not working. Today he'll be kind about it, but he'll say go." She folded her hands on the table. "And every day you didn't. Every day you just kept going, kept treating me like I was already part of things." "You were already part of things," he said. "I know that now." "Did you know then?" She almost smiled. "I suspected," she said. "The water barrels. You came back the next morning and there were 6 instead of 4. He hadn't told her he'd ordered 3 more. He'd just done it. She'd noticed. "That was when I stopped being terrified," she said. "Because a man who quietly gets more water barrels after a woman tells him he doesn't have enough, that's a man who's listening. And a man who listens—" She stopped. "I hadn't had one of those before." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held it. They sat like that while the evening came in full around them, and the ridge settled into its nighttime sounds, and somewhere below in the valley a light went on in a window, and then another, and then a dozen, the town coming to life in its small evening way, and none of it, not the town, not the valley, not the whole wide western dark, felt like anything other than exactly the right distance away, close enough to matter, far enough to let them breathe. Roy Decker moved his operation south by the end of summer. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't need to. Harrow Ridge understood what a departure without ceremony meant, and they let him go without ceremony. That was its own kind of verdict. Jessamine Pratt started coming up the ridge twice a week to help with the property, which began as practicality and became something else. A kind of apprenticeship that nobody formally named, but everyone understood.
the way the young sometimes find their way to the people who can show them what strength actually looks like when it's lived rather than performed. Clara taught her the fire lines. She taught her the water system. She taught her how to read smoke and how to file a land document, and how to stand in a room full of people who have already decided about you and say your piece anyway. Ethan taught her how to ride the ridge. She was a quick learner. The thing about building a life is that it doesn't happen at once. It happens in water barrels, ordered the morning after someone points out you don't have enough. It happens in a quilt laid over a sleeping woman by a man too tired to think straight, but not too tired to remember what decency looks like. It happens in two people sitting at a table, going over supply numbers in the evening, and one of them looking up and saying, "What?" and the other one saying, "Nothing," but meaning something enormous. Ethan Cross had spent 7 years deciding he was too much mountain for any person to want. Clara Hayes had spent 6 years being made smaller than she was. Neither of them had been wrong about what happened to them. They had only been wrong about what it meant. What it meant was not that they were broken. What it meant was that they were the wrong size for the places they'd been, and the right size for each other. And the mountain, difficult, unforgiving, beautiful, entirely itself, had been waiting the whole time for someone willing to stop being apologetic about how much space they needed. It had room. It had always had room. They just had to stop leaving before they found it. The first winter on the ridge was harder than either of them said out loud. Not between them. Between them, things were steadier than either of them had expected, which was its own kind of surprise. The good kind. The kind you don't fully trust for a while because you've been burned by good surprises before. But the winter itself was brutal in the way that high country winters are brutal. Not dramatic, not all at once, but relentless. The cold came in early October, and it stayed, and it got heavier every week, and the property that had seemed manageable in summer revealed itself in winter as something that required every ounce of what they had. Ethan rode the lines even in the cold, because fire didn't stop for weather, and neither did the job. Clara managed the property alone for stretches of 4 and 5 days, which she did without complaint and without the specific kind of pointed silence that complaining's cousin uses when the words stay in. She wrote things down. She kept lists. She tracked every supply, every repair needed, every weak point in the structure. When Ethan came back in from a long ride, she had the information ready, not as a report, not as a reproach, but as a handoff. Here's what happened. Here's what I did. Here's what still needs doing. Your turn. He'd never had a handoff before. He hadn't known how much he needed one. By December, he told her things he'd never told anyone. Not because she asked, but because the evenings were long and the fire was warm, and there was something about her particular quality of listening that made silence feel like a missed opportunity instead of a safe harbor. He told her about his father, who had been a big man too, and who had dealt with his bigness by becoming smaller inside it, quieter and quieter, until there was almost nothing left. He told her about the woman 7 years ago, the full version, not the abbreviated one he'd given on the porch. How he'd believed completely that she was it. How certain he'd been. How long it had taken to stop feeling like a fool for having been that certain. Clara listened. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't tell him he wasn't a fool. She just listened, and at the end she said, "The certainty wasn't the mistake. It was right to be certain about wanting something. You just had the wrong something." He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "You're not a fool," she said then, like she'd been saving it. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I just wanted to say it." January brought a problem nobody had anticipated. The territorial inquiry into the ridge fire had been running for 4 months. Whitfield had done his job. Whatever else could be said about the man, he'd filed properly and thoroughly, and the inquiry had produced enough documented evidence of deliberate ignition to make Roy Decker's denials increasingly expensive to maintain. But Roy had hired a lawyer from the territorial capital. A good one. The kind that didn't win cases so much as make cases too costly to pursue. The kind that found every procedural gap and every witness inconsistency and every ambiguity in the chain of evidence and turned them all into reasons why nothing could be proven to the required standard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Official letterhead. The inquiry had been suspended pending further review. Suspended, not closed, not decided, suspended, which was the legal system's way of saying, we are putting this in a drawer and hoping everyone forgets about it. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table. He set it down. He read it again. Clara was watching him. How bad? She said. The inquiry's been suspended. She was quiet for a moment. That means Roy walks, she said. For now. What does for now mean? It means the evidence is documented. It doesn't disappear. If anything else happens, anything else connected to Roy, or the railroad deal, or the land, he stopped. It means it's not over. It's just not moving. She stood up. She crossed the room. She picked up the letter and read it herself, all the way through, with the focused attention she gave everything that mattered. Then she set it down. All right, she said. All right, he said. We can't control what the inquiry does, she said. We can control this property. We can control the fire lines and the water access and the Eastern Corridor filing. She looked at him. Roy Decker is not on this ridge. He is 6 miles south of here, trying to convince a railroad company that he's still useful to them, which I suspect he's finding difficult. She folded her hands. He lost. The fact that he didn't get convicted of it doesn't change that he lost. The deal moved east. Our filing stands. He looked at her. That's a very practical way to look at it, he said. I'm a practical woman. You're also angry, he said. She paused. Yes, she said. I'm also angry. But angry doesn't fix the water barrels, so? She picked up her coat. I'm going to check the north line. The temperature dropped again last night, and I want to make sure the barrel seal's held. She went. He sat at the table for a moment after she left, looking at the letter. Then he thought about what she'd said. He lost. And he realized she was right. In the way she was usually right, which was not halfway, but all the way down to the bone. Roy Decker had wanted the ridge devalued, the filing contested, Clara shamed out of the county, and Ethan isolated again. He had none of that. He had a railroad deal 6 miles east and a lawyer's bill and whatever Roy Decker sat with alone at night when nobody was watching. That was the shape of losing. The inquiry being suspended was Roy's lawyer's work. The outcome was still Roy's. Ethan got up and went to help with the north line. Spring came back slow, and then, all at once, the way spring does at elevation. One morning you wake up, and the particular weight of the cold has lifted off the air, and something underneath it is moving again, green and insistent, like the mountain remembering what it was. Jessamine Pratt came back up the ridge in April with 2 things: a basket from her mother, which was an apology from the Pratt family in the language that families use when they're not quite ready to use words, and a piece of news. Roy Decker's selling, she said, setting the basket on the porch table with the particular satisfaction of a person delivering good information. The South Flat property. He listed it last week. Railroad offer fell through in February. They went with the eastern route, and Roy's land isn't worth what it was to them anymore. Clara and Ethan looked at each other across the porch. "Who told you?" Clara said. "My father," Jessamine said. "He had supper with the county assessor on Friday."
The assessor said Roy's been trying to sell since January, but nobody's offering what he wants. She paused. The assessor also said the fire damage from last summer reduced the assessed value on the south parcels considerably, which is... She stopped. "That's what happens when you set a fire on land you're trying to sell, I suppose." "Justice," Clara said, simply. "More like arithmetic," Ethan said. Clara almost smiled. "Sometimes those are the same thing." It was Tom Aldridge who brought the second piece of news, and he brought it in person, on horseback, on a Thursday morning in May when the ridge was green for the first time since Ethan could remember caring what color it was. Tom was a plain-spoken man. He and Ethan had been neighbors for 11 years, with the particular neighborliness of men who respected each other's land and didn't intrude on each other's business. He tied his horse at the gate, came to the porch, accepted coffee, and got to the point the way plain-spoken people do, which is immediately. "3 families on the South Ridge want to talk to you," he said. "The Aldersons, the Pruitts, the widow McAllister. They've been thinking since last summer about a joint fire agreement, pooled water access, shared line maintenance, coordinated response when the scouts call something in." Ethan looked at him. "That's never been done on this ridge," he said. "No," Tom said. "But Clara held a line last summer with 4 people and a borrowed shovel, and the barn's still standing. The Aldersons lost 2 outbuildings in '71 because nobody knew about the fire until it was already past their fence line." He set down his coffee. "People remember things differently when they've got something to compare them to." Ethan was quiet. "What would the agreement look like?" Clara said. She had come out of the house and sat down on the step below the porch rail, and neither man had interrupted to acknowledge her arrival, because that was no longer a thing that required acknowledgement. She was there. That was how it was now. Tom outlined it. Water sharing in dry stretches. Joint maintenance on the primary access road. A signal system, flags or fire, so that news of a smoke sighting could move between properties faster than a rider. Monthly meetings in rotation between the properties through fire season. Clara listened. She asked 3 questions. Specific, logistical. The kind that came from someone who had thought about systems before and knew which points were where things broke down. Tom answered all 3. "When do they want to meet?" Ethan said. "Saturday," Tom said. "If you're willing." Ethan looked at Clara. She nodded once. "Saturday," he said. Tom picked up his hat. He looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has something else to say and is deciding whether to say it. He said it. "My wife wants me to tell you, Clara, and I'm saying it because she's right, and because I should have said something closer to when you arrived, that the things that were said about you in this town last summer were wrong. People made judgments that weren't theirs to make, and they made them loud, which is worse." He held her gaze. "You handled it better than most people would have. Better than most people could have. That matters to the folks up here, even if they're slow saying so." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Thank your wife for me," she said, "and tell her, this is the best coffee cup I've had since Kentucky." She lifted her cup. "I'd appreciate the recipe if she's willing." Tom's face broke into something that looked very much like relief. "She'll be delighted," he said. He rode back down. Ethan watched him go, then looked at Clara. She was looking at her coffee cup. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. She looked up. "It's strange, being seen by people after being invisible for so long. It takes some getting used to." Good strange or bad strange? She considered it seriously, the way she considered most things. "Good," she said. "Definitely good. Just strange." The Saturday meeting was the beginning of something none of them had a name for yet.
7 people in Tom Aldridge's front room, maps on the table, arguing in the productive way that neighbors argue when they're actually trying to solve a problem rather than win a point. Clara ran the water access portion of the discussion, and nobody questioned it, which told Ethan something significant about how quickly competence becomes its own authority when you stop waiting for permission to demonstrate it. By the end of the evening, they had a working draft of an agreement, 3 volunteer line captains for different ridge sections, and a signal protocol that Tom's youngest son had drawn up in a neat hand on a piece of card that would be copied and posted at each property. On the ride home, Ethan was quiet in the particular way that meant something was moving through him that he hadn't finished processing. Clara let the quiet run for a while. Then she said, "Say it." 15 years on this ridge, he said. I've been out there alone every fire season since I took the post. Nobody ever asked about a joint agreement. Because you never needed them, she said. You were handling it. Yes. So they let you, she said. People let capable people carry things alone. It's easier. She looked at the road ahead. Doesn't mean they didn't care. Means they were comfortable. And now? Now they're not comfortable, she said. Roy Decker made them uncomfortable. Last summer made them uncomfortable. Discomfort is good for agreements. She paused. Besides, you've got a wife now. Wives talk to people's wives. Wives build things. He looked at her sideways. Is that what you've been doing? I've been having coffee with Millie at the dry goods store every Thursday, she said, with complete composure. One conversation at a time. He stared at her. You didn't tell me that. I tell you everything that concerns the property and your safety, she said. Having coffee with Millie concerns neither. Clara, straight both directions, she said, does not mean every direction. It means the ones that matter. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That is a very convenient interpretation. Yes, she agreed pleasantly. I thought so. The fire season that second summer was bad across the territory, but not on Harrow Ridge. Not because the weather was kinder. It wasn't. The summer of 1876 was as dry as 1875, and the lightning came earlier, and the valley below reported 3 significant fires in other counties that had burned ranches and taken stock, and sent families to start over in towns that weren't their own. On Harrow Ridge, the signal went up twice. Both times, 7 properties had people on their fire lines inside an hour. Both times, the brakes held. Both times, the fires that might have run burned down to nothing because there was nowhere left for them to go. The Valley Station wrote a report about it. The territorial paper picked up the report. Somebody in the territorial office read the paper and requested a copy of the Joint Ridge Agreement, because apparently it was the only successful fire coordination in the territory that season. Whitfield sent a copy. He wrote to Ethan with the letter. The letter said, among other things, that the inquiry into the 1875 Ridge Fire had been reopened, as new information had come forward from a member of the railroad survey team who had been present during conversations between Roy Decker and persons unknown in the week before the fire. The letter said this information was specific and documented. The letter said that Roy Decker had been formally questioned and that further proceedings were expected. Ethan read the letter at the kitchen table. Then he read it a second time. Then he handed it to Clara. She read it. She set it down. She was quiet for a long moment. He's going to have to answer for it, she said. Looks that way. I thought... She stopped. I stopped expecting it. I told myself it didn't matter. Did you believe that? He said. She looked at him honestly. About half the time, she said. The other half, I was just saying it because I didn't want to keep carrying the wanting of it. He understood that completely. He'd done the same thing, in the same kitchen. about different things, for 7 years. It matters, he said. Yes, she said. It does. She picked up the letter again, read the final paragraph, set it down again. It doesn't change what we built. The agreement, the lines, the neighbors. That happened because it needed to happen, not because Roy got what he deserved. I know. But I'm glad he's getting what he deserves, she said. So am I. She nodded. She folded the letter. She put it in the small wooden box where she kept important documents. The land filings, their marriage certificate, the closing papers on the mill property from Kentucky that she'd kept because she'd earned them and they were hers. She put Whitfield's letter in there with the rest of what mattered. Jessamine Pratt was 19 by the time she told Clara she wanted to be a fire line captain on her family's section of the ridge. Clara said yes before Jessamine finished the sentence. Ethan was there when it happened, and he watched Jessamine's face when Clara said yes. The particular expression of someone who had prepared for a longer conversation and found the door already open. And he thought about 5 women who had stood in his yard over the years and seen what the life was and decided they weren't built for it. He didn't blame them. He thought about Clara, who had stood in the same yard and asked where he kept the water barrels. He thought about how the difference wasn't courage exactly. The 5 women before her weren't cowards. The difference was fit. They had come looking for a life that matched the one they'd imagined, and this one didn't match, and they were right to leave. Clara had come looking for a place she could be the full size of herself. This was that place. That was all the difference. In August of that second year, when the ridge had held through the worst of the fire season, and the agreement had been tested and proven, and Tom Aldridge had shaken Ethan's hand with both of his and said, "I should have done this 10 years ago." Ethan came home one evening to find Clara on the porch with a letter in her lap and an expression he'd never seen before. Not troubled, not afraid, something quieter than both of those. He sat down beside her. "What is it?" he said. She held the letter out. It was from a woman in Millhaven County, a name he didn't recognize. He read enough to understand. A former neighbor, someone who had known Clara and Daniel, someone who had been one of the voices that spoke against her in the aftermath of Daniel's death. The letter was an apology, a real one, not the careful kind that protects the writer more than it helps the recipient. A genuine one, specific and uncomfortable and honest, the kind that costs something. He read it all the way through. He handed it back. "She heard you were doing well," he said. "She heard about the Ridge Fire Agreement. Apparently it was in a territorial paper that reached Millhaven." Clara looked at the letter. "She said she always knew I was good. She said she was scared after Daniel died, and scared people make noise, and she's been carrying it since." "Are you going to write back?" he said. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way she made decisions, all the way through. "Yes," she said. "Not because I need her to have said it, but because she was brave enough to say it, and brave things deserve to be received." He looked at her. "You're a better person than most," he said. "No," she said. "I just know what it costs to carry something you should have put down." She folded the letter. "I don't want her carrying it." He reached over and took her hand. She held his. They sat there while the evening came down over the ridge, and from somewhere in the valley below, the lights of Harrow Ridge began to come on, one by one, the way they did every evening now. And Ethan could name most of the families behind each one. The Aldersons, the Pruitts, Tom and his wife Millie at the dry goods store, the Reverend, young Jessamine probably already at her desk writing something, because that girl was always writing something. He knew these people now. They knew him. Not as the man who was too much, not as the rough stone nobody could live with, but as the man who held the ridge, and whose wife had built the agreement that had saved the summer, and who came down to Harrow Ridge most Saturdays with Clara, and sat in the Reverend's pew, and after service drank bad coffee in the churchyard, and argued respectfully with Tom Aldridge about water pressure mathematics. That was who he was now. Not different from what he'd been, just finally in the right-sized place. Roy Decker was convicted in October on 2 counts related to the deliberate setting of the 1875 Ridge Fire. The railroad company testified against him, which was the detail that made it stick. Not Jessamine's boot track identification, not Whitfield's report, but the railroad man's documented notes from the hotel dining room that Tuesday morning. Notes which had gone into a company file and stayed there until the inquiry reopened and someone thought to ask for them. Roy got a fine and 6 months and a record that followed him wherever he went after that. Clara heard about it from Millie on a Thursday. She came home and told Ethan. He said, "Good." She said, "Yes." And that was all either of them needed to say about Roy Decker. What the story of Ethan Cross and Clara Hayes became, in the telling, was a love story. That was fair. It was a love story. But it was also something else, something harder to name and more important to say. It was the story of 2 people who had been told, in different ways and by different people across different years, that they were the problem. Too much, too complicated, too damaged by history, too far outside what a person was supposed to be to deserve what a person was supposed to want. They had both, in their own ways, believed it. Ethan had built a life to accommodate the verdict. Clara had made herself smaller to escape it. Neither of those things worked. Neither of those things could work because the verdict was wrong. You don't fix a wrong verdict by accepting it. You fix it by living until it becomes undeniably untrue. That was what they did. They held the ridge through fire season and winter and legal battles and the particular slow work of building trust with people who had been slow to extend it. They made the agreement that saved the summer. They raised the signal flags and rode the lines and sat at the table in the evenings, going over numbers with the steady companionship of 2 people who have decided that this specific, ordinary, difficult, beautiful life is what they chose. They argued. They were wrong about things, separately and together, and they said so. They disagreed about the water pressure mathematics and about whether the gray horse needed a new shoe that week or next week, and about whether Jessamine Pratt should be the one to handle the Northern Line captain position, or whether it was too much responsibility for someone her age, which Clara said it absolutely was not, and Ethan eventually agreed. They were not a perfect couple. They were better than that. They were a true one. And on the ridge, in the years that followed, in the fire seasons that came and the winters that bore down, and the slow accumulation of days that become a life when you live them one at a time, in all of it, neither of them ever became smaller than they were. They just kept growing, together, into every bit of space the mountain had to offer. And the mountain, difficult, unforgiving, entirely and unapologetically itself, had more room than anyone had ever given it credit for. It always had. Some people just needed to stop running long enough to find out.